This video is a follow-up to my previous video. In the first video, what I did was I walked through another YouTuber, Ontocubism. He has a version of a phenomenalist ontology that I tried to lay out my understanding of it as best as I could. And he's since posted a few more videos clarifying a few points that were really interesting to watch, and I think clarified a few things, but I still think that there were a few differences in the way that in our conclusions that I hinted at in the first video that I think still remain after the videos that I've seen. So this video here is gonna highlight first some of the points that we agree on, because there are very deep channels of agreement between his view and mine. And then I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on a couple of the points where I think we diverge. So I have here the outline of the 6 major points that I extracted in the previous video. So I'll go through them really quickly here. So first is that the world is a set of phenomenal fields, which he calls faces. The second is that basically there's a very close, almost identity between a sort of conscious entity or conscious perceiver, a phenomenal stream, and what he calls a face. One point that he makes very eloquently is he is careful not to identify the self as being only the stream, but that the self is a sort of phenomenon that occurs within the stream. And he makes a distinction between a couple different types of selves that I discussed in the first video that I won't go further into here. But essentially, the phenomenon of a self is something that is present within the stream or within the world, but it's not the stream itself. And I have a lot of agreement there on the idea of selves being very much part of the world. We also agree that what he calls qualitative presencing is sort of his way of stating being or existence. And I also agree that I share a strong intuition that all being or existence is qualitative in some deep fundamental way. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later in this video. Now, where we really begin to depart is when he says that the entities of the world all have their being in the phenomenal streams. And I think that's a bit too far for me to stretch, because I'll explain exactly where I think we depart on this. Some of it has to do, I think, potentially with our definition or perceived meaning of phenomenal, but I think there's an actual ontological difference there as well. So I'll be discussing that later. And then finally, just to clarify, not all things are or have faces. So far you could read this list and take away from it some kind of panpsychism where even inanimate objects have a face, and that their being then is manifest in these faces also. But he says, he leaves open the possibility, but it's in no way a fundamental feature. He leaves open the possibility that there are no faces associated with these inanimate objects. And so I think that leads to potential questions about how their being exactly is accounted for, and regularities in their being that we'll be discussing here. So the points of agreement that we have are pretty deep, like I said. We share a very deep intuition that all existence is qualitative. How that existence manifests itself qualitatively, I think we take slightly differently. But we do share a very deep intuition that all existence is qualitative. Neither of us thinks that there's much meaning to be found in trying to categorize the things of the world as either mental or physical. I definitely agree with him there. He had a very vibrant way of describing what he calls the emptying of the subject, which is basically saying that there is no subject that's outside of the world. There is no separation. The subject itself is as much part of the world as any physical thing. A couple points that I didn't really talk about in the first video, but are points of commonality. The goal of his ontology is to prescribe reality to the real world, to the life world. The life world being the sort of world that we walk around and live in every day, of chairs and tables and refrigerators, and I share that kind of impetus with him, and the way that we achieve that is very different. So to him, he says basically, all that is our conscious or phenomenal stream of the life world, and even the objects that are apparently in the life world behind that are not there. And I approach it differently. I have he calls himself a radical pluralist. I'm a pluralist in a different way, in that my pluralism is one in which I believe that there are a large number, if not infinite number, of ways that you can slice up the world or parse out the world in meaningful ways. You know, some of those ways come out with tables and chairs, and others come out with electrons, and others come out with the perception that I have of the pen on my desk right now. But none of those is, it doesn't make too much sense to me to call some of those real and some of them not. They might have different types of reality, but I don't make any distinction. So in that way, I'm very much a pluralist in terms of existence. I think that there are a lot of different ways of parsing out the world, and I don't privilege particular ones over others. I think that if they make meaningful sense, give a meaningful explication of what's going on in the world, then I think it makes perfect sense to call them real. And he definitely takes a different tack to that, because he says even for him, reality is only what's in those phenomenal streams, and anything else outside of that is basically excluded from being quote-unquote real. The last thing that we agree on is the point of ontology, which I agree with him, is basically to create a coherent framework for explication of the world. And he's very adamant about making the distinction between explication of the world and explanation of the world. And so, and just to go into what he means by that, or what I take him to mean by that. So explanation would be giving a particular set of reasons, or and we'll be seeing a sort of an example, a toy example of a sort of explanation here in a second, for some particular phenomenon in the world. But explication is more like giving an account of the circumstances that have to be present in order for an explanation to take place. Is the way that I would think of it. So we also agree very much on sort of what is the goal of doing ontology. Where I'm going to start is what I think is the most concrete issue that I see with the picture, and it's one that I would say is a sort of theoretical, epistemological point. It's one he's very much. I believe he's very much interested in sort of the economy of his viewpoint, and I agree with him that in a certain way it has a certain kind of economy, in that if you're just looking to minimize the number of entities that you take to be in the world, well, if you have, if the sort of standard view is to have, if you have two perceivers perceiving an object, well, now you have three objects because you have two perceivers and one object. Or if you want to go to a lower level of some sort, you could just consider the perceptions and the object, which might be more agreeable to him. But in any case, though, I think that misses a critical point, in that it doesn't consider the relationships between the objects. And so I'm going to kind of demonstrate here where I think what happens in his viewpoint is actually something that is a much less parsimonious view, or a much less simple view, when you have to take into account giving particular explanations of the world. Now, I want to make it clear here that I'm not it's not the job of the ontology to give particular explanations, but it is the job of the ontology to set the conditions for explanations to be made. And I think when you just say, or make it basically an axiom that you cannot postulate independently existing objects outside of the phenomenal fields, then I think that you have eliminated a type of explanation from possibility that makes sense of a large amount, basically all regularities in the world that we take to be independent of ourselves. And so just to lay out this picture, so right here you see what is my indication of two perceived apples. So we have two perceivers, perceiver A and perceiver B. They both have their perception of some apple, and that line between them is not meant to represent any existent or ontological thing. All it is meant to do is to represent that there is a correlation between these two things. So the perceiver A sees a red apple, perceiver B sees a red apple. So in normal investigation of the world, whether it's from day-to-day life or more formally in the sciences, when we find correlations, we look for explanations of those correlations. Now, in some cases, there's no explanation to be found. They're accidental, or when you start to get into more fundamental parts of a scientific theory, you may need to take them as brute facts. And I also want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with taking something to be a brute fact. I mean, every theory, explanation, ontology, worldview, put whatever epistemological object you want in there, every single one of them is going to be grounded in some set of brute facts. But what we want to do is come up with both explications and explications that allow for explanations that reduce the number of brute facts that we have to accept. So just to make that more concrete, so we have here our system of two perceivers, and the correlation that's going on here is that even if the color of the apple that they're perceiving at any given point in time is different, they always perceive the same color of the apple. So first red, green, yellow, red again, green, red. So the correlation is that they always, no matter what color the apple happens to be, they always see the same apple. Well, okay, so we have two perceivers here and we have one correlation. That seems like a pretty clean picture, and I would agree that it is. Let's go now to a system with three perceivers. So now we have three perceivers and three perceptions, and we see that in order to add the one perception, we've added two more correlations. So now we have a correlation not only between A and B's perceptions, but also between A and C's perception and between B and C's perceptions. And it's the same scenario here, as they all perceive the same color of the apple in any given instance. But we see now, when we expand to 5 apples, we've drastically expanded the number of connections that we have. And this is the problem. The more perceivers that you add to this picture, the more correlations that you have to account for. So when you add the nth perceiver, you have to add n minus 1 correlations each time. So each time you add another perceiver, you have to add more correlations to account for all these things being like each other. And so, like I said, it's very important to realize that these arrows are not ontological. I'm not saying that they're anything that exists. I'm just saying that epistemologically, our goal in giving explanations is to try to account for these regularities, and hopefully in a way that gives an account of them in a way that doesn't keep exploding faster and faster in the number of brute facts that we have to accept. So in the picture with the faces, if we take each of these independent perceivers as having its own face, and that the entire existence of the apple is within those faces, and that when new perceivers are present to the apple, or the apple is present to the perceivers, that new aspects of the apple are basically now existent that were not previously. We have more and more of these correlations that we don't have any account of, and without being able to postulate some independently existing apple, it seems to me that you've just ad hoc created a rule that just completely eliminates any possibility of giving an explanation of the apple, unless I'm completely missing something. So we can see here we have the same scenario where at each step they're going to perceive the same color apple, but now we have, I believe it's 15 correlations in this case. And the more the more perceivers we add, the more and faster that the number of edges is going to grow. So a very simple and natural simplification of this system is just to postulate, hey, maybe there's a single independent apple that each one of these perceivers is correlated to. And so instead of having this exploding system of correlations that we need to explain, each time a new perceiver is added, there's only one new correlation between the perceiver and the independently existing apple. And so the same correlations are present. It's just that instead of all of them having unaccounted for correlations with each other, we understand them all as having a correlation to an individual independently existing apple. And I think that this is the best way to account for this. It's the most natural and intuitive way to account for it. And it's ultimately, it seems to be just completely ruled out, just ad hoc, just by having the rule that there are no independently existing objects. And so while on its face, the sort of phenomenalist picture that Ontocubism offers might seem to have an economy, in my mind, it is actually the opposite. It lacks economy for this reason of just being unable to consolidate and give explanations of regularities we have in the world. Now, this picture here is one of 5 perceivers, presumably of some single apple at a particular time. But the same concept basically applies to a single perceiver viewing the same apple at multiple different times, or different perceivers at different times. Any sort of correlation, basically, you can give the same sort of account. So whether you're talking about, on a phenomenalist picture, sort of the mystery of why there seem to be regularities that are unaccounted for before any perceiver exists, which, it seems to be that our universe, at least all the regularities, would indicate that there was a time that there were no perceivers, and that there would be a time in the future where there are no longer any perceivers. So all this is basically a mystery on the phenomenalist picture, and you're basically precluded, as far as I can tell, from giving any explanation from it. Now, I mentioned this to Ontocubism, and his response was that this sort of structure that I have, where we have these edges, which are the lines, in math, basically a network, the lines in a network are called edges. He said that his structure would just be the set of apples. And the thing that I think that's missing is that I'm not saying that these edges are anything that is ontological or existing that you have to add to your ontology. What I'm saying is that it's a correlation that you need to account for, and if you're unable to account for it, you have to take it as a brute fact. So in one picture, you have an exploding set of brute facts that you have to accept, and on the other picture, you have a sort of clean, consolidated view of how these correlations come about. So that's my most concrete objection, and the one that I would say really sort of that's the most significant objection that I have. There are a couple other things though. So for one thing, I think that there's a strange asymmetry that comes about in his view, where the objects that appear within these phenomenal streams, if it's an inanimate entity, it's only encompassed within the phenomenal streams. But if it happens to be a conscious entity, we grant it existence and its own phenomenal stream. So there's this weird privileging of conscious entities, or I call them conscious entities. I know he probably doesn't love that term. Whatever you want to call them, privileging of phenomenal fields or whatever. That seems to me to be a bit suspicious, especially because I think we should all, especially always be suspicious. And this is a sort of conceptual example, but it's just something. It's a good rule of thumb. If we're doing something that privileges our own viewpoint or our own attributes, such as being, closely associated with the phenomenal stream, and we say that the only things that exist are within things like I know he doesn't like the terminology within either, but you get the picture, associated with phenomenal streams. I think that there's something to be skeptical about there. So what I'm going to do next is, there are some other objections, but I'm going to put them aside because I think I've pinpointed where our point of departure is. And so we both start from a strong intuition that all reality is qualitative. And I think that you can even launch an argument that says that it is that way almost by definition, in the sense that I see things as either abstract or qualitative, where the abstract are structural things or mathematical things or things that you are specifying the relationships between things. An abstraction is sort of by definition divorced from its instantiation. So, a triangle I could draw in the sand, or I could draw it on a piece of paper, or I could draw it on a computer screen. And in other cases, you could say the same thing about counting numbers or whatever the abstract concept might be. There's not just one dog, there's a whole class of objects that we call dogs. I think that qualities are inherently different from that. Qualities are, by their nature, ineffable. They're things that you sort of have to be or have that quality in order to fully understand it. So in the same way that to somebody who is blind, no amount of explaining what sight is like to them is going to enable them to understand what a color would be. So I think there is a sort of sense that almost by definition existence is qualitative. It cannot be abstract, and I think that the two are basically a partition of the whole space. So you can only be in one or be in the other. And so if that's the case, it's sort of true by definition that existence is qualitative. So we share this deep intuition, but where we differ is that to him, all qualitative things are sort of by definition conscious, and he also says that they're by definition situated, that they have a sort of point of viewness, and that's where I differ with him. So I think it's possible to imagine a very simple system, like a system that can only experience somehow. You can imagine some system, whether it's reasonable or actually possible. You can imagine a system that just experiences the color red or something like that. No further structure. Maybe it never even changes. Maybe it flashes red and black or something like that. I mean, to me, I wouldn't consider that system a perceiver. It's whatever it is. It's qualitative, sure, but it doesn't seem in any way to me to be a perceiver or a phenomenal stream or any such thing. It just seems to be some sort of a qualitative, unstructured system that's sort of minimal interest to beings like us humans. And so, and my intuition actually is that's how the world is. So inanimate objects, whatever their qualitative aspects may be, they're probably things that have nothing to do with our own sensorial organs, but they're probably either chaotic or sort of periodic or have minimal structure, and probably are organized in a way, and probably in many cases just completely incoherent, probably organized in a way that's not meaningful to us, but nonetheless there is some sort of core of quality there behind their existence. I think that's a perfectly coherent picture of the world. And so in his picture, basically he rules out that possibility that there are qualities that are independent of a phenomenal stream or a conscious agent. And as soon as you accept that, I think most of the rest of his viewpoint pretty much follows from there. Because if you say that all existence is qualitative, and then you say that all qualitative things have to be within phenomenal streams, well then it's just a matter of deductive logic that it follows that all things must be phenomenal streams. So I'm pretty sure that this is where we differ, and maybe it's just a point that we have a difference on, and there might not be any resolving it. But I'd be interested to hear from him if he thinks that this might be a crux of. I mean, I'm sure there are other there are other differences in opinion, but I would be curious to hear from him if he thinks that this one is sort of particularly fundamental or more significant maybe than some of the others.